grew up in British Columbia, where the forests are endless and beautiful, but they can also be isolating. My parents owned a small cabin near the edge of the Rocky Mountain Trench. We spent summers hiking and winters snowshoeing, but I never really understood how dangerous those woods could be until the fall I decided to visit alone. It was mid-October, and the air had that sharp crispness that signals winter isn't far away. I'd been living in Vancouver for a few years, and life had been hectic. The thought of escaping to the cabin for a few days sounded perfect. Just me, the trees, and some peace and quiet. The drive up was uneventful. I arrived late in the afternoon, unloaded my supplies, and settled in. The cabin hadn't changed much: a small wood stove, a creaky old bed, and the faint smell of pine that always seemed to linger no matter how much time passed. The nearest neighbor was a good 10 kilometers away, and cell service, forget about it. The first night was uneventful. I spent it reading by the fire and listening to the faint sounds of the forest outside. But the second night was different. I'd spent the day exploring an old trail my dad and I used to hike. It was overgrown now, the path barely visible under fallen leaves and underbrush. I made it back to the cabin just before dusk, feeling tired but satisfied. After dinner, I locked up and went to bed early, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're completely exhausted. I don't know what woke me up at first. Maybe it was the wind or the creak of the trees outside. But as I lay there in the darkness, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It was a sound, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the underbrush. I sat up, straining to hear. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was out there. The logical part of me tried to brush it off. It could have been a hiker or maybe a hunter who'd wandered too close to the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I got up, pulled on a sweater, and went to the window. The forest was pitch black save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. I couldn't see anything, but the rustling continued, now accompanied by the occasional crack of a branch. It was closer. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, and my breath formed clouds in the air as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the tree line, the light cutting through the darkness. At first there was nothing, just the same dense forest I'd seen 1,000 times before. But then I caught it, just for a second. Movement. A shadow slipping behind one of the trees. "Hey!" I shouted louder this time. "This is private property!" The rustling stopped. The forest was suddenly, unnaturally quiet. I stood there, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, waiting for some kind of response. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I backed inside, locking the door behind me. I stoked the fire, telling myself it was just some lost camper, but deep down, I didn't believe it. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting in the armchair with the flashlight in one hand and a fire poker in the other. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. But the rustling didn't return, and by dawn I was convincing myself I'd overreacted. I packed up that morning, deciding to cut the trip short. As I loaded the car, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, large and distinct, circling the cabin. They led from the forest to the back window, the one overlooking the bedroom, then back into the woods. I didn't stick around to look for more. I drove straight back to Vancouver, my hands gripping the wheel the entire way. I never told my parents about what happened, and I haven't been back to the cabin since. It started as a weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning a camping trip for months, eager to escape the noise of Calgary and immerse ourselves in nature. We picked a remote spot in Kananaskis country, tucked away from the usual hiking trails. It wasn't a campground, just a clearing we found on a map, but that was the appeal. No crowds, no distractions, just the wilderness. There were 4 of us: me, Noah, Priya, and Callum. We'd all grown up camping and hiking, so none of us thought twice about how remote the location was. We packed plenty of gear, food, and even a portable GPS in case our phones lost service. We thought we were prepared for anything. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the scent of pine was everywhere. We set up camp near a small creek, spent the day exploring, and gathered around the fire that evening to roast marshmallows and share stories. It was the kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. The second night, though, was when things started to feel wrong. It began subtly. Priya was the first to notice. "Do you hear that?" she asked as we sat around the fire, the flames crackling in the cool night air. "Hear what?" Callum replied. She tilted her head, listening. "Nothing. It's too quiet." She was right. The usual background noises of the forest, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, were gone. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. We laughed it off at first, blaming it on nerves or the isolation, but the unease lingered. Later that night, as we lay in our tents, I heard it, a faint snapping sound like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't close, but it was deliberate, too heavy to be a small animal. I thought about calling out to Noah and Callum in the next tent, but decided against it. Maybe it was just paranoia. The next morning, Priya was already up when I emerged from my tent. She was standing by the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. "What's up?" I asked, still groggy. She didn't look at me. "There's something out there." I followed her gaze but saw nothing. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound casual. She shook her head. "Number whatever it was watching us last night. I saw movement." Her tone sent a chill through me. Priya wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Still, we tried to brush it off and went about our day, though the tension was palpable. That evening, we decided to stay up late, thinking that a shared campfire and some jokes would lighten the mood. It worked, for a while. But as the fire burned lower, the uneasy quiet returned. Then we heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable, crunching through the underbrush just beyond the light of the fire. We all froze, our heads snapping toward the sound. Noah grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees, but there was nothing there. "Probably an animal," Callum said, though his voice wavered. "Animals don't walk like that," Priya whispered. We decided to call it a night, but none of us slept. The footsteps came again, circling the campsite, always staying just out of sight. At one point, Noah unzipped his tent and yelled into the darkness, "Who's out there?" No response, just the sound of footsteps retreating. By dawn, we were exhausted and on edge. As we packed up to leave, Callum pointed out something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints. They were scattered around the campsite, overlapping with our own, but they led away from the clearing and deeper into the forest. The realization hit all of us at once. Someone had been out there watching us. They could have approached our tents at any time, and we wouldn't have known. We left in silence, walking quickly but carefully back to the trailhead. None of us spoke until we were back in the car, heading toward the highway. "Who do you think it was?" Noah asked finally. "I don't want to know," Priya replied. "We haven't gone camping together since. The forest, once a place of peace and escape, now feels like a reminder of how exposed we are when we think we're alone." I'm not one to believe in urban legends. Stories about strange disappearances or unexplained events usually roll off me like water off a duck. But what happened last spring changed how I see the world, or at least how I see the forest. It was supposed to be a simple research trip. As part of my environmental studies program at the University of Alberta, I'd signed up to collect soil samples in a remote section of the boreal forest. The area, deep in northern Alberta, was untouched by development, an ecologist's dream. The assignment was straightforward: spend 2 days collecting data, then report back. My professor, Dr. Neeson, had been clear about the risks: wildlife, weather, and the importance of sticking to the mapped trails. I was dropped off by a local guide early on a Friday morning. The plan was to hike a marked path to a pre-designated site, set up camp, and begin collecting data. I had all the essentials: a GPS, a map, food, water, and a small tent. The first day went smoothly. The forest was alive with sound: birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. By sundown, I had reached my campsite, a small clearing near a shallow creek. The night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. Spending the night alone in the wilderness wasn't something I did often, and every shadow felt like a potential threat. Still, I managed to get some sleep. The next morning, I set out early. My GPS guided me to the first sample site without issue. The soil was rich, darker than I'd expected, and I carefully bagged and labeled each sample. It was around midday when I noticed something odd. A second set of tracks appeared on the trail. They weren't mine. These prints were larger, made by boots heavier than my lightweight hiking shoes. At first I thought it might be another researcher, but the tracks weren't fresh. They looked at least a day old. The guide hadn't mentioned anyone else being in the area, and the trail wasn't exactly popular. Unease settled in my chest, but I kept moving. I had a job to do. By late afternoon, I reached the second sample site. The forest here was denser, the canopy so thick that barely any sunlight reached the ground. As I crouched to collect the soil, I heard it, a faint, muffled thud, like something heavy falling in the distance. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself it could be anything. A branch falling, maybe even my imagination. Still, the unease was there, prickling at the back of my neck. I quickly finished my work and started back toward the campsite, my senses on high alert. The trail felt different on the way back, more constricting, as if the trees had moved closer together. The tracks I'd seen earlier were gone, erased by the day's wind and fallen leaves. When I reached the clearing, I found my campsite undisturbed. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. I decided to pack up and move closer to the creek, where the openness felt safer. I set up my tent quickly and started a small fire, hoping its light would keep whatever was out there at bay. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of an animal made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard it again, a muffled thud. This time, it was closer. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the hunting knife I'd brought, a precaution, not something I ever expected to need. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight and knife in hand, sweeping the beam of light across the trees. There was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. The forest stood still, as if holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. At first light, I packed up and started the trek back to the drop-off point. The forest seemed to close in around me, every sound amplified, every shadow suspicious. When I finally reached the road, my guide was waiting, leaning against his truck. He took one look at me and frowned. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. His expression told me he already knew. I never submitted my soil samples. To this day, I don't know what caused those sounds or why the forest felt so oppressive, but I haven't been back since. Some places, I've learned, aren't meant to be disturbed.